All right, so picture this. You're a nomadic herder,
Hmm.
right? You're in the Horn of Africa, and you've been tending your flock for generations, like your ancestors have. And then suddenly some guys show up with maps. They start drawing lines all through the land you've been grazing on for, like, forever. And they tell you, well, tough luck, this part's Ethiopia now, and that part over there, that's Somalia. Talk about a rude awakening, right?
Yeah, it's crazy to think about.
Well, that's the kind of colonial legacy we're going to be dealing with today as we unpack the Somali-Ethiopia conflict. This isn't just some regional dispute, folks. This thing runs deep.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how those arbitrary borders drawn during the 19th century, that scramble for Africa, still have such a huge impact today. Think about it. The Somali people, they were and are predominantly pastoralists. Their lives have been intertwined with that land for centuries, and suddenly they're divided by these lines on a map.
Drawn by someone who's never even set foot there, probably.
Exactly. It was practically guaranteed to cause tension and conflict from the very beginning.
Okay, so we've got the British and the Italians playing these map-making games, basically, carving up the Horn of Africa without a second thought for the people who actually live there.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond just lines on a map, right? This
Mhm.
is about a clash of identities, historical grievances we're talking about, the struggle for self-determination. It's like this messy geopolitical knot that we need to untangle.
Mm.
So tell me more about this whole irredentism thing. How did that fuel the fire between Somalia and Ethiopia?
Irredentism is basically this deep desire to unify people who share an ethnicity or a culture under one nation state. It's kind of like a powerful magnet, pulling at those who feel like they're connected to their cultural kin, even across political borders. When Somalia gained its independence in 1960, this sentiment just exploded among the ethnic Somalis living in Ethiopia's Ogaden region.
And for our listeners who might not be familiar with the area, we're talking about a huge chunk of land, right?
Oh, yeah. The Ogaden region is vast, about the size of the United Kingdom, to give you some perspective.
Wow, okay. So you've got all these ethnic Somalis looking across the border at this newly independent Somali state, and they're feeling this pull, this yearning for unification.
Absolutely. And that made Ethiopia very uneasy, to say the least.
Right, because from Ethiopia's perspective, this is a significant chunk of their territory. And I imagine there are some valuable resources in the Ogaden region as well.
Exactly. Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie at the time, wasn't about to let go of that land without a fight. Control of the Ogaden wasn't just symbolic, it was about resources, political influence, and the very idea of a unified Ethiopia. So you have this tug of war over the Ogaden, fueled by Somali irredentism and Ethiopian resistance, basically a powder keg just waiting to explode.
And explode it did in 1977 with the Ogaden War.
Right, and this wasn't just some small-scale conflict either. We're talking about the Cold War, superpower meddling, the whole 9 yards. It got very messy very quickly.
So set the stage for us. How did this regional conflict get caught up in the global power struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union?
Well, the Cold War had a way of turning local conflicts into proxy wars. The superpowers loved to find these regional hotspots and use them to try and outmaneuver each other. And the Ogaden War was no exception. The Soviet Union saw an opportunity to expand its influence in the Horn of Africa, so they initially backed Somalia, provided them with weapons, military aid, all that thing.
So Somalia, feeling emboldened by this superpower backing, launches a full-on invasion of the Ogaden.
Precisely. They were aiming to unite the Somali people under one flag, just like they'd always dreamed of.
This sounds like it escalated quickly. But I'm curious, you mentioned the U.S. eventually backed Ethiopia.
Yeah.
What made the Soviets switch sides so abruptly?
The Soviets were definitely known for playing hardball, but the Cold War was all about shifting alliances, strategic maneuvering, and sometimes just plain old opportunism. In this case, it seems they saw a chance to back what they thought might be the winning side. They abruptly withdrew support from Somalia and threw their lot in with Ethiopia, who, as you mentioned, already had some level of support from the U.S.
Hold on, so the Soviets basically left Somalia high and dry in the middle of a war.
Pretty much. It was a brutal move, even by Cold War standards.
Wow, that's cold.
Yeah.
How did that impact the conflict on the ground? Did it completely change the course of the war?
It definitely had a seismic impact. You have to remember, this was a brutal conflict even before the Soviets switched sides. But that sudden influx of Soviet weaponry and advisors significantly bolstered Ethiopia's defenses. It completely shifted the balance of power.
Talk about a game changer. It's wild to think how these global power dynamics played out in such a devastating way for the people caught in the middle. But before we get into the war's consequences, I want to talk about the human cost of this conflict. What happened to the everyday people, the families, the communities caught in the crossfire of this Cold War proxy war?
Imagine being caught in the middle of that chaos. Your life completely upended by forces completely outside of your control. The Ogaden War brought immense suffering to the region. Villages were destroyed, livestock decimated, and countless families were torn apart. It created a humanitarian crisis on a massive scale, displacing millions and leaving a legacy of trauma that still lingers today.
It's heartbreaking and so easy to forget about those individual stories when we talk about geopolitics and military strategy. But we have to remember that behind every headline, behind every border dispute, there are real people whose lives are shattered by these conflicts. It's a sobering thought.
It really is. And unfortunately, the suffering didn't end when the fighting stopped. The war's legacy continued to cast a long shadow over the region.
Right, because the war couldn't last forever. So what ultimately led to the end of the fighting, and what were the long-term consequences of this Cold War entanglement in the Horn of Africa?
By 1978, the war had reached a stalemate. It was this bloody, brutal stalemate fueled by superpower weaponry, and ultimately, it just became unsustainable. A ceasefire was declared.
So we've got a ceasefire, but something tells me this story is far from over.
You'd be right to think that the Ogaden War might have officially ended, but the underlying issues, the dream of a greater Somalia, those didn't just disappear.
Of course not. And that's where things start to get really interesting, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, because the next chapter in the saga involves the unraveling of Somalia itself.
So we've got a ceasefire in place, but it's not like everything is just hunky-dory now, right?
Mhm.
We're talking about really deep tensions. This dream of unification for some and for others, this fight for territorial integrity. Not really a recipe for lasting peace or anything. So what happened in the aftermath of the Ogaden War? Did things actually calm down, or was it just like sweeping the problems under the rug?
Yeah, you're right to sense that kind of lingering tension there. The Ogaden War might have officially ended, but all those underlying issues, they didn't magically disappear. I think of it this way, it's like covering a volcano with like a giant tarp. You might conceal the immediate danger for a little bit, but that potential for another eruption, still very much there. Ethiopia, with the Soviet Union backing them up, emerged from the war in control of the Ogaden, but that dream of a greater Somalia, that idea of uniting all ethnic Somalis across those borders, it didn't just vanish.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's not like Ethiopia got away unscathed either, right? What was the cost of this victory? And what about the people caught in the middle of all this? We talked about the war's devastating impact. Where do things stand for them in the aftermath?
It's heartbreaking. The human cost of the Ogaden War was absolutely staggering. Beyond just the immediate casualties, the conflict left these really deep scars on the entire region. Millions of people were displaced, families got scattered, and traditional ways of life were just completely disrupted. Imagine having to flee your home, leaving behind your land and everything you know, just because of some political lines drawn in the sand.
Right. And it's so easy for us to sit here and talk about the big picture stuff, but we can't forget about those individual lives shattered by this conflict. It's a good reminder that behind every headline, every border dispute, there are real people just trying to survive, trying to put your lives back together after something like this. So what happened to all those people displaced by the war? Did they ever get the chance to return home?
Many of them never did. The Ogaden War created this massive refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of ethnic Somalis had to flee across the border into Somalia. And those refugee camps, they became like breeding grounds for more resentment, more poverty, more instability. It's tragic irony, really. The very conflict that was supposed to unify the Somali people ended up displacing them, dividing them even further.
A tragic irony indeed. And then, as if things weren't complicated enough, you mentioned something about Somalia itself facing its own internal struggles. Didn't the country completely implode into civil war around this time? How did that factor into this already volatile situation with Ethiopia?
Yeah, you're right. The story takes another complicated turn in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Just as the region was trying to recover from the Ogaden War, Somalia itself fractured. The Siad Barre regime, the same one that launched the Ogaden invasion, was overthrown, leaving this power vacuum that very quickly spiraled into a really brutal civil war.
Oh, wow. So now you have two conflicts happening at the same time, feeding off each other.
Yeah.
The unresolved tensions from the Somali-Ethiopia conflict and then the implosion of Somalia itself. That's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
You got it. The Somali Civil War wasn't just some internal issue. It had huge regional consequences. Armed groups, some even with ties back to the Ogaden conflict, they saw an opportunity in all the chaos, and they exploited it further, destabilizing the entire Horn of Africa. The conflict spilled across borders, dragging Ethiopia right back into the mix. It reignited all those old animosities.
It's like a nightmare scenario. A region that's still reeling from one war gets plunged into another layer of violence and instability. It's hard to imagine coming back from that.
So, What was the international response to this new crisis? Did the world finally step in and try to help? Or was the Horn of Africa just left to fend for itself?
The world definitely took notice, but the response. It was a mixed bag, to say the least. There were good intentions for sure, but also a lot of strategic blunders. The U.S., still haunted by the Black Hawk Down incident in 1993, became really wary of getting directly involved in Somalia again.
Right, the Black Hawk Down incident. That was a major turning point in how the U.S. approached intervention in the region.
Exactly. The memory of that failed mission made the U.S. really hesitant to get bogged down in another Somali conflict. Meanwhile, Ethiopia, understandably concerned about the instability right on its doorstep, took a more active approach. So Ethiopia is dealing with the fallout of the Ogaden War, this massive refugee crisis, and now a spillover from the Somali Civil War. Talk about having your hands full. How do they even begin to navigate a situation this complex?
Ethiopia was walking a tightrope, for sure, driven by their own security concerns and this desire to prevent the conflict from spilling over even further into their territory. They had to play this really delicate balancing act. They provided support to some Somali factions while fighting against others. And on top of all that, they had to contend with a new player in the region, the Islamic Courts Union, or ICU.
The Islamic Courts Union, a new player on the field, with their own agenda, their own ideologies. How did their emergence change the dynamics between Somalia and Ethiopia?
The arrival of the ICU in the early 2000s just threw another wrench in the works, really. It added yet another layer of complexity to the Somali-Ethiopia conflict. The ICU, with their strict interpretation of Islamic law, wanted to establish an Islamic state in Somalia. And that really alarmed Ethiopia. They saw the ICU as a direct threat to their own security and a potential supporter of Somali irredentism within their own borders.
Wow, so now we're seeing this shift, right, from a conflict that was mainly about territory and Cold War rivalries to one that's becoming increasingly shaped by ideology and the rise of these Islamist movements. It's like the stage is being set for a whole new chapter in the Somali-Ethiopia saga, and this one has implications far beyond the Horn of Africa. But before we dive into the 21st century and the rise of groups like Al-Shabaab, maybe we should take a step back and recap. What are the key takeaways from this incredibly tumultuous period?
Absolutely. The years following the Ogaden War were a time of just massive upheaval and transition for the entire Horn of Africa. You have the unresolved issues from the war itself, millions of people displaced from their homes, and then the collapse of Somalia as a state. It all created this incredibly volatile mix. And then the ICU emerges, adding this whole other dimension of ideological and religious strife to an already incredibly complex situation. It's like the perfect storm. It helps explain the incredible challenges, maybe even some of the opportunities that Somalia and Ethiopia would face in the 21st century.
And it's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, isn't it? Getting to peel back the layers of history, understanding how we got to where we are today. It's never as simple as it seems on the surface, is it? It just goes to show you how much history matters.
It really does. And the Somali-Ethiopia conflict, it's the perfect example of how the past just keeps rearing its head.
So as we move into the 21st century, we're left with a region scarred by decades of conflict, a legacy of displacement, and the rise of new ideological players like the ICU. It's a recipe for disaster, right? But maybe, just maybe, there's a chance for a new beginning. We'll have to dive into that in the final part of our deep dive. All right, so we're in the 21st century now, and things are pretty intense. The Horn of Africa is grappling with this legacy of conflict. The Islamic Courts Union is on the rise, and then there's the whole specter of international terrorism. It's a lot to process. So where do things stand between Somalia and Ethiopia as we enter this new era? Have they managed to find any common ground?
It's complicated, that's for sure. There have been some hopeful signs, some steps towards cooperation. But of course, the past always has a way of casting a shadow.
So it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Sometimes it feels that way. On the one hand, both countries seem to be recognizing that this constant animosity, it doesn't benefit anyone. They've made some real strides towards rapprochement in recent years.
Rapprochement. That's a fancy way of saying they're trying to bury the hatchet, right? After decades of conflict, what's driving this change of heart?
Well, a big part of it is just plain pragmatism. Both countries are facing some serious threats, especially from Al-Shabaab, and they've realized that they can't really counter something like that alone. Cooperation, at least on security matters, is paramount.
Makes sense. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's got to be more than just shared threats, right? There's got to be more to this rapprochement than just a common enemy.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely more nuanced than that. There's a growing understanding that economic cooperation working together is vital for the entire region to prosper. They've had these high-level diplomatic visits, signed trade agreements, and they're even exploring joint infrastructure projects. It seems like Finally, they're starting to see each other as potential partners instead of just rivals.
Well, that's encouraging. It sounds like there's actual progress. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've talked about the deep mistrust, the historical grievances, this idea of Somali irredentism. That stuff doesn't just disappear overnight, does it? I mean, it's hard to picture a complete reconciliation after everything that's happened.
You're right to be skeptical. Those wounds, they run deep. Healing takes time. And while the governments might be shaking hands and making deals, there's still suspicion. There's still animosity among some people on both sides. The memory of the Ogaden War, the displacement, the suffering, it lingers.
It's like trying to build a house on a foundation that's full of cracks.
Right.
Any little tremor could bring the whole thing down. So what needs to happen for lasting peace to actually take root? Is that even possible, given all the baggage?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. Lasting peace, it requires a completely different approach. It's not just about signing treaties or having fancy diplomatic meetings. It's about addressing the root causes of the conflict, those historical grievances that continue to fuel the animosity.
That sounds incredibly difficult. So how do you even begin to address something as deep-rooted as historical grievances?
It's a long and challenging process, for sure. It means encouraging dialogue and reconciliation, but not just at the top. It needs to happen at the community level. People need to be able to share their experiences, to voice their grievances, and most importantly, to listen to each other. And of course, it means ensuring that everyone's rights are respected and protected. No one can feel marginalized or excluded. That's a recipe for disaster.
That's a tall order, especially considering how fragile both states are. Are there any signs that these kinds of reconciliation efforts are actually happening, or does it still mostly talk?
There are some promising initiatives for sure. Some are further along than others. But the important thing is that they're happening. You've got these civil society organizations. They're working tirelessly to bridge the divides and build understanding between Somali and Ethiopian communities. There are cultural exchange programs, education initiatives focused on shared history and values. These efforts might seem small, but they're so important. They're planting the seeds for a future where peaceful coexistence is the norm, not the exception.
It's good to hear some positive news, to be honest. It's easy to get bogged down in all the negativity. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? Al-Shabaab. They seem to thrive on chaos and instability. How do they factor into all of this?
Al-Shabaab is a major challenge, a huge obstacle to stability and peace. They exploit existing grievances, prey on communities that are already struggling. They benefit from weak governance and instability. It's like adding another layer of complexity to an already incredibly complicated situation.
So they're both a symptom and a driver of the conflict. It's a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And their presence just highlights how interconnected everything is. We're talking about security, development, historical grievances. You can't address one without addressing the others. Military solutions alone, they're not going to defeat al-Shabaab. You have to get at the root causes of this kind of extremism. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. It's a massive undertaking.
It sounds daunting, to say the least. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From the colonial roots of the Somali-Ethiopia conflict to the emergence of al-Shabaab, we've really gone deep. So, any final thoughts for our listeners? What are the key takeaways here, especially for those who might be learning about this conflict for the first time?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history matters. It shapes the present in ways we often don't realize. The Somali-Ethiopia conflict is a perfect example of that. The echoes of past injustices, those arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers, the unresolved grievances, it all continues to influence what's happening today. It also highlights how interconnected our world really is. What might seem like a regional conflict in the Horn of Africa, it has ripple effects. It can impact global security, migration patterns, even the fight against terrorism.
So we can't just ignore these seemingly distant conflicts. They have a way of coming back to haunt us, don't they? As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. I mean, there's hope. We've got those efforts at Rapprochement, the grassroots peace-building initiatives. But there's also the reality of deeply ingrained challenges. It's a tough situation.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a delicate balance between hope and skepticism. The road to lasting peace in the Horn of Africa, it's going to be long and difficult. But as we've seen, history isn't set in stone. With consistent effort, a real commitment to dialogue, and a willingness to address past wrongs, there's always a chance for a better future.
Well said. And for you, our listener, we'll leave you with this. The Somali-Ethiopia conflict is a microcosm of the challenges our world is facing today. It's a complex story of historical grievances, political maneuvering, human resilience, and this constant search for peace. We encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and engage in thoughtful conversations about how we can create a more just and peaceful world for everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep.